Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, de la chef de l'Opposition.
Les électeurs.
Voters in Liberal strongholds in Toronto and Montreal have rendered their verdict. This Prime Minister, after 9 years, is not worth the cost. After 9 years of this Bloc Liberal government, we've seen the greatest expansion in the federal government in history, the most expensive centralizing government, including when it comes to the cost of housing and groceries in Quebec. How can the Bloc keep this government in power when it's so bad for Quebec? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to answer a question that has to do with the Canadian economy, because it gives me the opportunity to celebrate some good news that we got this morning. Inflation was 2%, and that's back to pre-pandemic levels. It's such good news for our country. Conservatives should be celebrating that. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure people who are waiting on waiting lists for food banks or lineups for food banks, or who are living in camps or homeless shelters, they'll be celebrating today. They'll really be celebrating the fact that after the highest inflation in 40 years, prices are still going up. They're not going back down. So the question is, why does the Bloc want to keep the most centralizing, expensive government in power when they have no respect for Quebec's jurisdiction or for Quebecers? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader is showing once again that he's incompetent when it comes to the economy. The fact is that the 2% level is where Canada was before the pandemic. The fact is that since the beginning of this year, inflation was within the Bank of Canada's target range. The fact is that for 19 months now, wages have outstripped inflation. But Conservatives just want bad news for Canadians.
Leader of the Opposition.
Canadians in the former Liberal strongholds of Toronto and Montreal have now given their verdict. After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Taxes up, costs up, crime's up, time's up. Mr. Speaker, isn't it time for Canadians to have a chance to render their verdict right across the country, electing a common-sense Conservative government that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime?
I ask members, especially members on the far side of the House, to please not to take the microphone until they're recognized by the Speaker. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I am so glad to have the chance to talk about the economy. That is because today we had good news for Canadians. Inflation is back down to where it was before COVID hit. Inflation has been within the Bank of Canada's target range this whole year. Wages have outpaced inflation for 19 months in a row. But the Conservatives don't want to talk about it. They are so weak and spiteful that for them, good news for Canadians is bad news that they want to ignore.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, this incompetent finance minister would tell you that you should celebrate that after prices rising faster than at any time in 40 years, they continue to rise, just not as quickly. I'm sure the people living in tent encampments, or the record-smashing 2 million people lined up at food banks, or the 1 in 4 kids going to school hungry after 9 years of this government will be celebrating. But what we now find out is that it's worse than we thought. According to a document just released, the government's second carbon tax will cost $9 billion in lost GDP. Why won't we have a carbon tax election to decide?
The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I think we all know why the Conservatives are so panicked about an election. It's because they can see that the economic news is good. They can see that we are now back to exactly where we were before COVID hit. They can see the Bank of Canada has lowered interest rates 3 times in a row, and wages have been ahead of inflation for 19 months. That's good news for Canadians. It's bad news for Conservatives.
And once again, I apologize. Normally, I would indicate out of respect to all members by saying the Honourable, and I forgot to do that in this case, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The bad news is we now have 1,800 homeless encampments in Ontario. Shame. 35 in Halifax alone. 2 million Canadians lined up at food banks after 9 years of NDP Liberal government. And now that we learn that on top of the $25 billion annual hit of the first carbon tax to our GDP, the second carbon tax will subtract another $9 billion a year, over $35 billion in lost GDP. That's almost $2,000 per family. Why won't this costly NDP Liberal government allow Canadians to vote on the carbon tax?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I am so glad to have the chance to talk about housing because there is more good news Canadians should know about. And that is that we have extended to 30 years amortizations for all first-time home buyers. That means more young Canadians can buy that first home and afford that mortgage. We've extended to 30 years amortizations for all new homes. That's to encourage what we know we all need, more homes built faster. But these weak and spiteful Conservatives cannot celebrate good news for Canadians because it's bad news for their partisan interests.
Yes.